Good morning. I'd like to welcome you again. This morning we're going to hear Dr. Leland Ryken offer Legacy of the King James Bible. Dr. Ryken is professor of literature at Wheaton College, where he's taught since 1968. We welcome him back to HBU. Dr. Ryken has a long-standing interest in the Bible and Bible translation. Among his many books are 1974, The Literature of the Bible, 1985, How to Read the Bible as Literature, 1987, Words of Life, A Literary Introduction to the New Testament, 1988, Effective Bible Teaching, 1993, Words of Delight, A Literary Introduction to the Bible, also in 93, A Complete Literary Guide to the Bible. In 2002, The Word of God in English, Criteria for Excellence in Bible Translation. In 2005, Choosing a Bible, Understanding Bible Translation Differences. Also in 2005, Ryken's Bible Handbook. And again, Translating Truth, A Case for Essentially Literal Bible Translation. In 2007, the Literary Study Bible, which is a ESV edition. In 2009, Understanding English Bible Translation, The Case for an Essentially Literal Approach. And in 2010, his most recent work, The Legacy of the King James Bible, celebrating 400 years of the most influential English translation. In addition, Dr. Ryken served as literary stylist for the 2001 ESV Bible. I will now read from 1 Corinthians 13, King James Version. Dr. Ryken uses this particular chapter in his class on 17th century literature as a prime example of 17th century prose style. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Welcome, Dr. Ryken.
The best of classics the world has ever admired. That is what McGuffey's fifth eclectic reader claimed about the King James Version of the Bible. David Norton, in his book, A History of the Bible as Literature, claims that the quoted passage is the first recorded reference to the Bible as the best of classics, though I will show at the end of my address that it is not the last of those claims. The McGuffey's Reader Series is itself an example of the historical influence of the King James Bible, which is the subject of my address this morning. The McGuffey series was the most widely used school book in 19th century America. In fact, the series has never been out of print, and it has been enjoying a revival of interest in our own day. A biographer of McGuffey, an expert on the Reader series, claims that McGuffey, quote, felt that knowing the Bible was of utmost importance in a child's education. So the Bible figures prominently in the series. The King James Version of the Bible is the most influential book in the history of the English-speaking world. From approximately 1660 to 1950, the King James Bible was the preeminent book in England and America in virtually every sphere of activity that we can name: religion, family, church, politics, education, literature, art, and music. For nearly 4 centuries, the King James Bible formed what in literary and other academic circles is called the mythological universe of the English-speaking world. To explain that concept, I can do no better than quote from former Yale University professor George Lindbeck. Here's how Lindbeck describes the role that the English Bible played in English and American culture across the decades of its dominance. And it's a long quotation, so it's all from Lindbeck. Until recently, most people in traditionally Christian countries lived in the linguistic and imaginative world of the Bible. It was not the only world in which they dwelt, yet the text above all texts was the Bible. Its stories, images, conceptual patterns, and turns of phrase permeated the culture from top to bottom. This was true even for illiterates and those who did not go to church, for knowledge of the Bible was transmitted not only directly by its reading, hearing, and ritual enactment, but also indirectly by an interwoven net of intellectual, literary, artistic, folkloric, and proverbial traditions. There was a time when every educated person, no matter how professedly unbelieving or secular, knew the actual text from Genesis to Revelation. The Bible came to supply the conceptual and imaginative vocabularies with which we construe and construct reality. So pervasive is this scriptural idiom that much of Western literature consists of subtexts of the biblical text. Thus, all of experience, including sacred texts from other religions, such as the classics of Greece and Rome, was absorbed into the scriptural framework. And now the summary statement: Christendom dwelt imaginatively in the biblical world. The main point of the essay from which I have quoted is that English-speaking culture has become biblically illiterate. And I note with alarm Lindbeck's claim that, quote, when I first arrived at Yale, even those who came from non-religious backgrounds knew the Bible better than most of those now who come from church-going families. The onset of biblical illiteracy in English-speaking cultures began with the loss of a common Bible, which the King James Version had been for 3.5 centuries, and additionally, with the loss of the kind of Bible the King James Version is. For the remainder of this address, I will provide a wide-angle picture of how broadly the King James Bible permeated English and American cultures. Choosing a place to start is arbitrary, so I decided to start at a place that I found particularly interesting when I conducted the research for my book on the King James Bible. As I communed with myself, to use a King James phrase, it occurred to me that one evidence of the cultural presence of the King James Bible through the years is public inscriptions of texts from the King James Bible. So let me conduct a brief excursion with you on what public inscriptions tell us about the historical influence of the King James Version of the Bible. If you pass through the college gate at Harvard University, you will read, "Open ye the gates, that the righteous nation which keepeth the truth may enter in." Ironic indeed. This is Isaiah 26, verse 2, straight from the King James Version. I can give you something even more ironic as follows. During my graduate school years at the University of Oregon, every time I entered the library, I could look up and read the following engraving: "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." These public inscriptions on university campuses are less a comment on the influence of the King James Version in higher education, though they are that, than they are a testimony to the more general cultural influence of the King James Bible. I will also note that while the King James Bible made it onto these public inscriptions in the first place because of its cultural importance, once the inscriptions were in place, they kept the King James Bible continuously alive in people's sight and awareness. The King James Version is alive and well at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. The most celebrated instance can be found across the street from the main building. The space is called the Isaiah Wall, and it contains these words from Isaiah 2, verse 4. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The same verse is inscribed on the base of a statue that stands on the actual grounds of the United Nations headquarters. The world-changing Cavendish Laboratory of Cambridge University in England bore Psalm 111, verse 2 in Latin over the archway, but after the laboratory moved to its new site, the inscription appears over the archway in its King James form. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. Every year, 2 million visitors to the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia can read Leviticus 25, verse 10 in its King James form, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. We have all seen Bible verses on the walls of churches, a custom that goes back in England at least to the 16th century. You would be hard-pressed to find a church or cathedral where the texts are not from the King James Version. Even the imposing tablets of the Word that adorn the walls of Coventry Cathedral, a modern cathedral, are inscribed from the King James Version. Each of these 8 huge inscriptions consists of a statement that Jesus made about himself, and every time a visitor or worshiper looks at an inscription, the King James Version lives on, as in the verse, "For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost." Throughout the years, a gold-gilt Bible verse has been posted on the front wall of the suburban St. Louis church where I was married. It reads, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." As I look up from a pew at 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, I can see the following verses on memorial plaques on the walls, all from the KJV. "He being dead yet speaketh, being made conformable unto his death. Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." A stroll through the Iowa cemetery where my family members and acquaintances lie buried is a trip through famous King James resurrection verses. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. I am the resurrection and the life. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. I know that my Redeemer liveth." When the inscriptions that I have quoted were engraved and posted, the King James Version was the only major English Bible that existed. When people in the English-speaking world spoke of the Bible, they meant the King James Bible. I will conclude with some specimens of the King James verses that appear on the walls of the Dunham Bible Museum on the campus of Houston Baptist University. These verses contain statements uttered by famous people on landmark occasions in American history, as follows. "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." Benjamin Franklin during a debate at the drafting of the United States Constitution, with the words coming from Psalm 127, verse 1. "What hath God wrought?" Samuel Morse sending the first words over his newly invented telegraph machine, with the words coming from Numbers 23, verse 23. "When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained." Astronaut Buzz Aldrin on a television broadcast from space after his 1969 spacewalk, with the words coming from Psalm 8, verse 3. "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Abraham Lincoln in his acceptance speech for candidacy to the United States Senate, with the words coming from Mark 3, verse 25. The public inscriptions that I have surveyed already show the range of cultural influence of the King James Version, from universities to a world-famous science laboratory, to churches and cathedrals, to political speeches, to burial places, to public broadcasts. With my entry into the subject now complete, I want to proceed more systematically through the leading cultural spheres in which the King James Bible has been the most important book and central element of cultural cohesion in English-speaking cultures over a span of 3.5 centuries. It is customary to start with the influence of the King James Bible on the English language, but I have chosen instead to end there. It is hard to prove the influence of the King James Version of the Bible on English, but by the time I survey the dominance of the King James Bible across the spectrum of cultural spheres, it will seem self-evident that the King James Version has exercised the influence on the English language that scholars claim. So I will start with a subject for which we have hard data, namely the dominance of the King James Version in the field of book publishing. Sources claiming that the King James Version is the best-selling book of all time are too numerous to cite. According to Adam Nicholson, author of the book God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible, more than 5 billion copies of the King James Bible have been sold. According to David Daniel, in his magisterial book, The Bible in English, the King James Version is, quote, still the best-selling book of the world. Multiple sources claim that the King James Bible is the most frequently quoted book in existence. The author of the book, The Story of English, calls the King James Version the single most influential book ever published in the English language, and Bartlett's Bible Quotations agrees. A Rare Book website claims that the King James Bible is the most printed book in the history of the world. Gordon Campbell believes that the King James Version is the most important book in the English language. I think it obvious that in the history of book publishing, the King James Version is supreme. Was the King James Bible a publishing success in its own day? You be the judge. It went through 182 editions in the first 35 years of its existence, and after that, it was the only major English Bible for 3 centuries. I have surveyed the supreme stature of the King James Bible in the history of printed books. As I move now to other cultural spheres where the King James Version has been dominant for nearly 4 centuries, I will be giving snapshots or specimens that are parts of an overall picture. The second sphere that I propose to explore is education, and in particular where education starts, namely childhood learning. From the 17th century through the 19th, English and American children learned to read via the Bible, which for most of that time span meant the King James Bible. Children carried their Bibles to school, and in some eras and places, the King James Bible was either the sole or leading book used in school. When textbooks were available, such as the New England Primer, passages from the King James Bible were interspersed throughout the books. One scholar sums up the situation by saying that it is from the King James Bible that the English-speaking world learned to read and to think. And Robert Stone theorizes that the greatest vehicle of literacy in the English-speaking world has been the King James Bible. It has been the great primer. The secretary of the Wheaton College English department is a Filipino, and she says regarding her childhood education that, quote, the King James Version of the Bible has been the best English language teacher I ever had. Having cited that anecdote, I want to take another brief excursion down a bypath. The King James Bible is not solely an English and American book. It has been an influence in English-speaking cultures and subcultures around the world. In my 44 years of teaching at Wheaton College, I have witnessed a steady stream of students from non-Western countries, and overwhelmingly the English Bible of these students has been the King James Version. In my book, I devote paragraphs to the experiences of a music professor at Wheaton College who grew up in South Africa, a music professor at Philadelphia Biblical University who grew up in Hong Kong, and Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, who recounts his upbringing in his autobiographical essay entitled The Education of a British Protected Child, and who quotes from the King James Bible in his novels. David Daniel, in his book, The Bible in English, Its History and Influence, tells the story of the influence of the English and American Bible societies, and he entitles the unit that covers this history, KJV for the World. Benson Bobrook, in his book, Wide as the Waters, the story of the English Bible and the revolution it inspired, writes that, and I quote, Englishmen carried their Bible with them overseas, even as it came to live in their own language with more abiding force. Its impact on thought and culture eventually spread the world over, as wide as the waters be. And Alistair McGrath, in his equally great book, In the Beginning, The Story of the King James Bible and How It Changed a Nation, a Language, and a Culture, notes that the expansion of British economic and military influence in the later 18th and 19th centuries was preceded and accompanied by missionary work based on the King James Bible. Wherever English language versions of Christianity sprang up, these would usually be nourished by this definitive translation. Childhood education has been my second sphere of King James influence, with a side trip through the King James Bible as a non-Western as well as Western influence. A third sphere, where the King James Version was the dominant presence for 3.5 centuries, was the devotional and church lives of Christians. In fact, it was from this sphere that the influence spread outward into the other cultural provinces. I will provide a sketch of how this worked itself out in my own life, and the story that I tell was surely the norm for millions of Protestant families over the course of 4 centuries. I heard the King James Bible read after meals 3 times every day. A passage from the King James Version was printed conspicuously in the Sunday school handout on Sunday mornings. I heard the KJV read and preached on from the pulpit twice every Sunday. Bible memorization was based on the King James Version at both church and Christian schools. When a representative from the Gideons handed out maroon-colored New Testaments at my grade school, the translation was the KJV. When I was 9, my parents gave me an inscribed King James Bible as a Christmas gift, and I used it right through my college years. Religious plaques that hung in our home were verses from the King James Version. And if today you go into the guest bathroom in my house, you will see a plaque that I made in the 3rd or 4th grade by gluing the letters of dry alphabet soup to a piece of pegboard. It reads, "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered," from the King James Version. I've already eased my way into a related sphere of influence that I call religious discourse, consisting of sermons, devotional books, and Bible commentaries. From the mid-17th century to the mid-20th century, we can picture virtually all of the famous Christian speakers and religious writers as using the King James Bible. A few random snapshots will suffice to illustrate that claim. As I recently perused a booklet with excerpts from the past on the subject of justification, it was obvious that for several centuries, the King James Version was the common Bible of evangelical Protestantism. Here are the names of the theologians and preachers included in the booklet, accompanied by a specimen biblical quotation from each treatise that was excerpted. "Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus," Charles Spurgeon. "All the people that heard him and the publicans justified God," Charles Hodge. "With the heart man believeth unto righteousness," A.W. Pink. "Not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us," Horatius Bonar. "There is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked," J.C. Ryle. Just as we usually do not think to ask what specific English Bible the great English and American literary authors used, it is easy not to ask what English Bible the towering religious figures of the past used. What Bible did Jonathan Edwards use? Edwards' autobiographical work entitled Personal Narrative provides a ready answer. The scattered biblical quotations are from the King James Version. "Now unto the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. My soul breaketh for the longing it hath. A man shall be in hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest." What about Charles Spurgeon, who preached to thousands upon thousands at the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London? A quick look at Spurgeon's sermons, commentaries on the Bible, or devotional books like Morning and Evening will answer the question at once. Spurgeon used the King James Bible. He also endorsed it as the greatest English translation. In 1884, he wrote, "We have had 10,000 messages from our God to our very soul in the very words of the King James Bible. And we have prayed over and preached about the precepts and promises it enshrines till we feel a vested interest in the volume as it is." He was defending the continued use of the KJV in certain publications. And in a famous passage that praised John Bunyan's biblical vocabulary, Spurgeon put in a parenthetical statement about, quote, "our authorized version, which will never be bettered, as I judge, till Christ shall come." Beginning in the last quarter of the 20th century, the author of any Bible commentary has clarified in the prefatory part of the book what English translation has been used in the commentary. And in the commentary itself, multiple English versions are likely to be referenced. But for over 2 centuries, starting around the time of Matthew Henry's commentary, it was so axiomatic that the English translation used in a commentary was the King James Version that one will look in vain for any identification of the English Bible used by the author of the commentary. Matthew Henry's commentary, the most widely used commentary of English-speaking Protestantism for nearly 3 centuries, is an early example of that. Billy Graham will provide my final snapshot. One source estimates that Billy Graham has preached to live audiences totaling over 200 million, and some of his individual televised crusades have aired to more than 2 million. His combined lifetime audience, including radio and television broadcasts, has been estimated to be over 2 billion. What English Bible did those listeners hear? Anyone who has heard Billy Graham knows the answer to that. From the start of his evangelistic career to the end, Billy Graham held the King James Bible in his hand as he preached. I have surveyed spheres of influence that are distinctly religious spheres: education and Bible reading within the home, religious life in the church. But there are even more non-religious or public spheres, including the following: the courtroom. As I was writing my book on the King James Version, my wife picked up a book at a garage sale. That's not itself at all unusual. This one was entitled Classics of the Bar. Let me just say parenthetically that the history of my life as an author has been a kind of case study in God's providence. Again, just the right sources have passed my purview when I needed them, and not infrequently it is my wife, who is more widely read than I am, who has brought just the right source to me. It's been an exciting ride. Well, from the book Classics of the Bar, virtually every courtroom speech recorded in this volume contains quotations from the King James Version. For example, Benjamin Tracy, in his concluding speech in the case Tilton versus Beecher, 1875, quoted Proverbs 11, verse 21. Though hand join in hand, the wicked shall not be unpunished, but the seed of the righteous shall be delivered. Probably all of you recall how several years ago, in one southern courtroom after another, inscriptions of the 10 Commandments came toppling down as state courts mandated their removal. But the point for us is that for decades, the King James Version had been right there in the legal arena. The removal of engraved inscriptions of the Decalogue has not brought an end to the Bible in the courtroom. A recent article published in the New York City Law Review adduced dozens of examples in proof of the thesis that, and I quote, citations from the King James Version of the Bible are numerous in judicial opinions handed down in court to the present day. Political discourse. The King James Version has been the absolute favorite of British prime ministers and American presidents. Every time they have quoted from the King James Version, it has lived on in the active vocabulary of the populace. Someone has produced a 20-page tabulation of 250 biblical allusions in the writings and papers of George Washington, accompanied by the verse in the King James Bible that most closely corresponds to each one. The survey shows, incidentally, that Washington's favorite biblical image was the vine and fig tree passage found in Micah 4, verse 4. Abraham Lincoln's speeches show a continuous influence of the King James Bible, either by way of stylistic effects or direct quotation. A biographer claims that Lincoln's speeches and public documents were littered with biblical allusions. There is no better illustration than Lincoln's 10-sentence Gettysburg Address. In fact, someone has written a whole book on the indebtedness of Lincoln's most famous address to the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. The author finds dozens of biblical echoes in Lincoln's speech and concludes that what gives Lincoln's language its distinctive flavor is that it is overwhelmingly biblical, with 269 of its 272 words appearing in some form in the King James Bible. Even less literary presidents have kept the King James Version alive in public consciousness. In a brief address at the lighting of the Christmas tree on the White House grounds on December 24, 1945, President Truman directly quoted the following verses: "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." British Prime Minister Winston Churchill came at the end of the era of the King James Version as the unchallenged English Bible for use in public discourse. Some of Churchill's greatest speeches of World War II kept the King James Bible alive in his nation's active vocabulary. One of his wartime addresses includes this statement: "At that time, I ventured to draw General Waffell's attention to the 7th chapter of the Gospel of St. Matthew at the 7th verse, where, as you all know, or ought to know, it is written, 'Ask and it shall be given, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you.' As you all know, or ought to know." I cannot think of a better index to the degree to which for 3 centuries most English and American citizens were totally familiar with the King James Version. The most famous referencing of the King James Bible by an orator in modern times is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered on August 28, 1963, from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It is easy to surmise from the title by which the speech is known, "I Have a Dream," that King intended an allusion to Moses on Mount Pisgah viewing the Promised Land. Actually, King does not explicitly refer to either Moses or a Promised Land in this speech, although he did so in the speech he delivered the night before his assassination. Nonetheless, the King James Bible lives on in the "I Have a Dream" speech, partly in the elevated style and affective undertow of the speech, and partly in explicit allusions. Amos 5 verse 24 is present as King declaimed, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Isaiah 40 verses 4 and 5 asserts its presence with the statement, "I have a dream that every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." Music. Every Christmas season, selections from Handel's oratorio Messiah are performed and listened to all over the English-speaking world. Every time the Messiah is performed, the King James Bible lives on as a cultural influence. In fact, some passages of the King James Bible owe their familiarity more to the Messiah than to the King James Version itself. If you will allow a brief side trip, as the translation committee of the English Standard Version did its work, it quickly evolved a principle that we variously and informally called the King James principle, the Lord's Prayer principle, or Handel's Messiah principle. What this means is that the passage under consideration is so famous in its King James rendition that it would be self-defeating to change it. It stayed as it was in the King James Version. Almost as famous as Handel's Messiah are the biblical oratorios of Felix Mendelssohn. His oratorio Elijah does not follow the King James Version as continuously as Handel's Messiah does, but the King James Bible forms the skeleton on which Mendelssohn built his oratorio. The King James Version is present right from the opening song. "As God, the Lord of Israel, liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word." Shortly thereafter, a choral speech closely resembles Exodus 20, verse 5. "For he, the Lord our God, he is a jealous God, and he visiteth all the fathers' sins on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate him." Franz Joseph Haydn's The Creation is also in the tradition of great biblically based oratorios. It is based on the Bible and Milton's epic Paradise Lost. The following famous chorus does not quite quote verbatim from the King James Version, but it sounds like it, in which case we are speaking of the King James Version as a stylistic influence and model. "The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament displays the wonder of his works." Oratorios, of course, provide the most obvious opportunity for composers to incorporate the actual biblical text into their works, but other musical genres also lend themselves to it. Even among modern choral composers who do not predominantly link their compositions to the English Bible, the King James Bible keeps showing up. We can see this partly in the titles of compositions, with the result that people perusing lists of choral music or programs of concerts will find familiar King James lines kept alive in their active vocabulary. Here's a list of random examples. "In the Beginning" by Aaron Copland, "I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes" by John Rutter, "Sing Ye to the Lord" by Edward Bairstow, "Lord, Thou Hast Been Our Refuge," and "O Clap Your Hands" by Ralph Vaughan Williams, "If Ye Love Me" by Thomas Tallis, "God So Loved the World" by John Stainer. When we come to hymnody, the picture changes in a direction that is true of literary authors as well. It is this: Hymn writers, like poets, refer to the Bible and take the Bible as a source of material, but do not usually quote directly from it. Before we can link their texts with the King James Bible, we need to know that they use the King James Version in their daily lives. Once we determine that, however, we have warrant to think of the King James Bible when we read or sing their texts. Isaac Watts is an example. Watts' vocation was that of preacher, and writing hymns was his avocation. A look at Watts' collected sermon shows at once that his English Bible was the King James Version. Watts' tombstone in Bunhill Fields, London, includes as part of its inscription Colossians 3, verse 4. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, I shall also appear with him in glory. With that as a context, King James associations spring up continuously as we read and sing the hymns that Watts wrote, 750 of them. Watts' hymn, O God, our help in ages past, stands close to the biblical text. And Psalm 90 is the source of it. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations, the psalm begins. O Lord, our help in ages past, Watts' hymn begins. Our hope for years to come is the second line of Watts' hymn, echoing Psalm 90, verse 14, that we may be glad all our days. Before the mountains were brought forth, verse 2 finds its counterpart in before the hills in order stood. And these are only the beginning of parallels. It is hard to imagine what the tradition of English and American sacred music would look like without the King James Bible as its source. A mighty stream has flowed from the King James Version into our musical history. The visual arts. With the visual arts, it is even harder to link individual works with the King James Bible specifically. We have warrant for making the connection, though, if we can find evidence beyond the paintings that an artist's biblical imagination was fed by the King James Version. There are enough examples of this to allow us to make big claims for the influence of the King James Version on English and American painting. I will start with a stellar example, Victorian painter Holman Hunt's famous painting that he titled The Light of the World. There are actually two originals of this painting, the first one hanging in the chapel at Keble College in Oxford, and the second in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Hunt made the second painting because the first one was ill-kept, i.e., exposed to leaking pipes at Keble College. The painting pictures Christ standing outside a weed-overgrown door without a handle as the morning star rises behind him, creating a halo effect. Additionally, Christ carries a lantern, which is a second source of light in this nighttime scene. We are not left to guess what English Bible inspired the painting. The inscription is right on the frame. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to him and will sup with him and he with me. The title of the painting, The Light of the World, also alludes to Jesus' declaration, I am the light of the world. In his autobiography, Hunt sometimes links particular biblical paintings with verses in the King James Bible, and he links the light of the world with Psalm 119, verse 105. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. The work of American Quaker painter Edward Hicks is saturated with biblical resonances. His preoccupation was the peaceable kingdom motif from Isaiah's prophecy. In fact, Hicks painted it as many as 100 times. We are not left to guess what English version of the Bible Hicks used. Sometimes the King James rendition of Isaiah 11, verse 6 appears on the frame of the paintings. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. Literature. Of all the arts, literature is the easiest to link to the King James Bible. The subject is so large that it is hard to know where to begin. I want to pay tribute to our brother David Jeffrey, who is the world's leading authority on the influence of the Bible on English and American literature. In regard to my book on the legacy of the King James Bible, a decision was reached right at the outset that half of my book would be literary in nature, the literary qualities of the King James Bible itself, and its influence on English and American authors. I devote a whole chapter to quoting literary authors and critics on their preference of the King James Version over all other English Bibles. To speak the truth, I have never seen a literary author endorse any Bible translation except the King James Version after its appearance, except for Catholic authors, who sometimes choose the Reims translation for denominational reasons. To give you the flavor of the acclaim of literary people for the King James Version, I will dip into my chapter for specimen quotations and anecdotes. For the last decade of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's life, he had two books next to his bed, Martin Luther's Table Talk and the King James Bible. One of Coleridge's two King James Bibles that survive is heavily annotated by Coleridge. This is the context for Coleridge's famous statement that, quote, "The words of the Bible find me at greater depths of my being than all other books put together. Did you ever meet any book that went to your heart so often and so deeply?" Here is a miscellany of brief endorsements of the King James Version. Immeasurably superior to other translations, W.H. Auden. All supreme, Eudora Welty. Infinitely superior to other translations, Wallace Stegner. Unmatchable, Christopher Fry. Unquestionably the most beautiful book in the world, H.L. Mencken. Stylistically superior to all other versions, John Ciardi. The greatest English text, Mark Schorer. The best quip comes from John Steinbeck, who after seeing a movie based on the King James Bible said, "Saw the movie, loved the book." While none of these endorsements proves the widespread presence of the King James Version in literature, they all serve as signposts that direct us to what we will find when we start our excursion through English and American literature. This morning is not the right time and place for me to document the prominence of the King James Bible in English and American literature. I will be content with two well-known quotations from literary scholars. A British scholar who wrote a book entitled The Bible as Literature wrote near the end of the book that the Bible, quote, "achieves as we read a strange authority and power as a work of literature. It becomes one with the Western tradition because it is its single greatest source." And Northrop Frye, the most prominent literary scholar of the second half of the 20th century, wrote famously that the Bible is the major informing influence on literary symbolism. Once our view of the Bible comes into proper focus, a great mass of literary symbols begins to take on meaning. I come finally to the subject with which I said I would end, the influence of the King James Version on the English language. We can agree with David Daniel that the story of modern English as we know it starts with William Tyndale. The English language was in a distinctly impoverished state when Tyndale started to write, partly because a transition was underway from Middle English to modern English. According to Daniel, Tyndale's great gift to the English language was the establishment of an English plain style, which Daniel claims is a register above conversational English. I would say 2 registers above. I do not have time to pursue a side skirmish here, so I would just state that my research does not confirm the common picture of a colloquial Tyndale as over against a polished King James Version. It is true that the King James translators had a sure instinct for betterment with regard to the inherited tradition of English Bible translation, but often this polishing resulted from the simplifying of Tyndale's version. In any case, the King James Version is what codified the Renaissance tradition of English Bible translation and then made it a constant for nearly 4 centuries, right to the present day. What the King James Version chiefly contributed, though, was a style and a standard of linguistic excellence. This is what lies behind the following comments by scholarly experts. One of the unintended functions of the King James Bible was to establish norms in written and spoken English. Should not the language of the Bible shape the language of the people? The growing acceptance of the King James Bible in shaping public and private religious discourse inevitably had its impact on the language as a whole. Alistair McGrath. What the King James Bible did was bring standard English into the forefront of people's attention. The general style of the English language has been so influenced by the Bible because of this public presence. David Crystal. The AV English Bible has to a marvelous extent shaped our speech, giving peculiar connotations to many words and sanctioning strange constructions. William Rosenow. For generation after generation, it gave the English-speaking world a template against which to measure their own utterances. Adam Nicholson. The most customary way by which to demonstrate the influence of the King James Bible on the English language is to list the familiar idioms and proverbs that English-speaking people have owed to the King James Version through the centuries. Any list of these sayings and expressions is necessarily selective. The following list will just serve as well as any other. The land of the living, at their wits' end, heap coals of fire on his head, there is no new thing under the sun, the salt of the earth, A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. The signs of the times, in the twinkling of an eye. The root of the matter, fire and brimstone, Psalm 11, verse 6. A law unto themselves, labor of love, old wives' fables, as a lamb to the slaughter, fell flat on his face. The Bible quotations that appear in Bartlett's famous quotations have been segregated out and published as a freestanding book entitled Bartlett's Bible Quotations. The book is over 200 pages long. The editor explains in the preface that all quotations come from the authorized version of the Bible, surely the most influential book ever published in the English language. The editor also correctly states that the famous quotations were introduced by the King James Bible, picked up in the English vernacular, and entered popular imagination. What does a book like Bartlett's Bible Quotations show? It shows first that the King James Bible possesses the linguistic and stylistic qualities that enabled it to become the major influence on the development of the English language. Secondly, the book of Bible Quotations shows again how pervasive the King James Version became in the English-speaking world. Thirdly, these quotations point to the status of the King James Bible as a guardian of linguistic standards. What was at stake when American pioneers traveled westward with the King James Bible and then sometimes, according to oral tradition, Shakespeare's works also in their wagons? What was signaled is that there was a standard of stylistic excellence that the pioneers wished to preserve amidst conditions that seemed to threaten vestiges of English culture. At every point for nearly 4 centuries, English-speaking people had a touchstone of what good written and oral communication sounded like. I believe that I myself lived through that experience. I grew up on farms in central Iowa. My parents were immigrant children and neither finished grade school. Growing up with the King James Version in this unsophisticated milieu, I unconsciously knew that the King James Bible represented something exalted and excellent. As a grade schooler, I did not understand every word or phrase in the King James Bible, but I experienced that. I remember experiencing it as highly desirable. Something big was going on, and I intuitively knew that someday I would have an entry into that expansiveness. I can't help contrasting that to modernizing and colloquial and dynamic equivalent Bibles, where the omnipresent norm is that of a 6th grade linguistic and intellectual level. The well-attested irony is that the Bible reading public who has accepted a 6th grade Bible is a more biblically illiterate audience with every passing year. Nor does this surprise me. A Bible that sounds like the daily newspaper elicits the degree of respect and attentiveness that the daily newspaper elicits. When the King James Bible was constantly before me in grade school and high school, I had something that called me above the prosaic, something that inspired me to reach higher than I had yet attained, not keep me permanently at a 6th grade level. As I conclude my remarks, it will have been evident that 2 themes have converged in this address. Ostensibly, I have traced the historical influence of the King James Version, but the King James Version would never have exerted that influence if it had not possessed the superior qualities that make it the greatest English Bible. So I want to conclude with a few tributes to the King James Version from voices that count. It grew to be a national possession and is in truth a national classic. No other book has penetrated and permeated the hearts and speech of the English race. If everything else in our language should perish, it would alone suffice to show the whole extent of its beauty and power. And that was their triumph, a polished collation, a refinement of a century's translating, a book that became both clear and rich. It was the genius of the King James Version that it made the Word of God speak so directly to those who heard it that though men knew it was a translation, they could never really think of it as such, for never did a translation speak with such directness and life-giving power. Book titles include The Supreme Book of Mankind, The Book of Books, the greatest English classic. In popular Christian culture, the King James translation is seen to possess a dignity and authority that modern translations somehow fail to convey. The King James Bible retains its place as a literary and religious classic by which all others continue to be judged. On a historical scale, the sheer longevity of this version is a phenomenon without parallel. King James is still the best-selling book in the world. In the story of the earth we live on, its influence cannot be calculated. Finally, the authorized version is a miracle and a landmark. There is no corner of English life, no conversation that it has not adorned. Thank you.